In the summer of 2018, Western Pennsylvania birders, ornithologists, biologists, field-tripping teachers, Appalachian Range romantics, and trail-loving hikers all had reason to celebrate. The Nature Conservancy, one of the nation's largest environmental NGOs, had partnered with the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary to preserve these 2,380 acres of wooded bird habitat some 80 miles or 130 kilometers outside of Philadelphia. In the grand scheme of things, the move wasn't anything major. By itself, a massive environmental organization preserving an area the size of a small ski town didn't move the needle. But the deal was bigger than local interests alone. The benefits were global. To fund the preserve's protection, the Nature Conservancy, partnered with Bluesource, began selling carbon credits, and in an effort to offset emissions, JP Morgan Chase purchased over 96,000 of them. It wasn't just corporations buying in either. At just $15 a ton, individuals bought credits to account for their summer vacations, too. While small in scale, Hawk Mountain seemed a perfect project. A pragmatic effort that saved important habitat and refuge for local birds and people, and provided means for the environmentally conscious to address their own impact on the planet. The only problem was, as one intrepid investigative journalist would expose, it was all built on at best a massive oversimplification, and at worst, one big green lie. At the simplest level, forest carbon offset projects work by comparing the amount of forest preserved versus the assumed deforestation had it not been saved. This means that calculating a hypothetical baseline really informs the entire project and how many credits they can actually sell. And here lies the issue. All the carbon offsets sold to JP Morgan Chase and guilt-ridden individuals alike were calculated against a faulty baseline. This is the project's planning document, submitted in 2018 to the American Carbon Registry, and this is the baseline the project's built upon, that if it weren't for intervention, the forest would be subject to aggressive clear-cutting and high grading. The problem was, Hawk Mountain Preserve, as its name would suggest, was already a preserve. Since the 1930s, after the land was purchased by avid birder Rosalie Edge and the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary Association was set up, this area has been closely looked after, managed, and protected. The forest didn't need saving. It wasn't under threat, a fact borne out by the preserve's history and its own contemporary staff saying as much. Of course, if the forest wasn't under threat, then there wasn't much carbon dioxide here to save from entering the atmosphere, and thus, there wasn't many real carbon offsets. It's these very carbon offsets, cheap for the buyer but ultimately meaningless, that allow corporations like JP Morgan Chase, the very institution that invested more money in oil and gas than any other bank from 2016 to 2020, to make claims like this, that they offset all company travel through projects like Hawk Mountain. Carbon credits provide major companies an incredibly cheap green screen to hide behind, while their faulty offsets continually underdeliver. And this is hardly a problem unique to a bird sanctuary in Pennsylvania. Not far down the road from Hawk Mountain is Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Here, the Nature Conservancy brokered a deal to protect 22,000 acres and establish an offset market in 2011. First, it was Chevrolet that bought into the project, then in 2014, it was Disney who agreed to fund the area's protection through 2022. While the project helped Disney establish itself as an industry-leading offsetter, it did little to actually offset carbon emissions, as the baseline again assumed the area was threatened by aggressive harvesting. In reality though, recognizing the importance of the forest to their municipal water, Bethlehem had only actually harvested about 0.4% of the watershed's acreage in the prior 2 decades. The same thing happened here in Albany, New York, where offsets from watershed forests that hadn't been harvested in decades went up for sale in 2019. And here too, in a swath of forest known as Pennsylvania Ridges, where the Nature Conservancy began selling carbon credits in 2019, even though the institution itself had purchased the land in 1999 and preserved it ever since. Uninformed of or undeterred by the faulty logic, Disney bought 180,000 credits from the project. Across all of these, meaningless offsets actively undercut their own mission, and these issues extend well beyond the East Coast and well outside of the Nature Conservancy's purview. California's cap-and-trade program uses forest carbon projects so that heavy emitters can purchase offsets rather than lower emissions, and this program too has holes. Of the 193 million carbon offsets sold in the state, 156 million are forest credits, and of those 156 million, 131 million are called Improved Forest Management Credits, or IFMs. These IFMs provide credits by implementing best practices to maintain maximum carbon storage. Basically, they commit the project area to minimal harvesting for the next century. Now, in order to quantify the amount of credits each project produces, like with voluntary programs, there needs to be a baseline or an average common practice to judge the IFM against. California calculates this common practice number by breaking forests into regions generally informed by tree species and forest density. Each region, in turn, has an average carbon carrying capacity, and it's these averages that are the problem. Take this swath of forest here in Northern California. It's relatively wet, it's heavily wooded, it's composed primarily of large, dense Tanahuac and Douglas fir, and according to the state, it sits in the Southern Cascade supersection. Because this supersection is so large, it encompasses, according to Carbon Plan's research, 3 subregions of different ecological makeups where the 2 inland regions are relatively drier, more sparse, and able to store less carbon. Therefore, when creating a baseline for this project plot, ACR 189, the state used an average informed by data that doesn't represent the local environment and thus is artificially low. In their own analysis, which used more accurate and specific tree species data, Carbon Plan estimated that the section was overcrediting ACR 189 by 50%, and while this example sits on the upper end of overallocation by the state, their research showed that of the 65 IFM projects they studied, 53 had overallocated, leading to an overcrediting percentage of 29.4%. By using such broad forest classifications, California's program had unintentionally created meaningless carbon credits that quietly undercut their own emissions goals. And this issue isn't confined to national borders either. Around the world, project upon project is failing to live up to expectations. In Brazil, the Paituri made history by becoming the first indigenous tribe to sell credits to protect their own forest, most visibly to FIFA in 2014 to offset emissions from that year's World Cup. The next year, however, diamonds were found in the protected land, and the forest was quickly ripped to shreds by those looking for a quick profit, rendering the already sold credits meaningless. In a protected area of Cambodia that sold credits as forest coverage sat at 88%, independent analysis by ProPublica and Descartes Labs found that coverage had since dropped to 46% as state-sanctioned logging and population influx accelerated deforestation far faster than the project promised. In Indonesia, carbon offsets were sold to protect a span of forest for conversion into acacia plantations, despite the fact that the government had placed a moratorium on plantation development in the area. Among myriad other issues, Nikkei Asia found that 3 times more carbon was sold as credits than the project was likely to actually offset. Time and time and time again, projects are making their money up front and then failing to live up to the long-term promise that encompasses the entirety of their value. These forest projects fail to address all 3 vertices of the carbon offsetting triangle, the trio of factors that make for theoretically effective crediting. It makes intuitive sense, for example, that a proper carbon offset must be permanent or that the rate of decline must be accounted for. What makes this difficult, though, is monitoring illegal harvesting in remote areas, or projecting future fire losses, or anticipating what climbing temperatures will do to the ecological makeup of a forest. The project also needs to ensure that the carbon they sequester isn't just leading to increased emissions elsewhere, that the CO2 isn't leaking out. It's one thing to protect a swath of forest in the developing world, but it's another to ensure that that doesn't lead to more aggressive clear-cutting elsewhere beyond the reach of state authorities or even roads. Finally, and perhaps of most difficulty, it's crucial for an offset project to prove that the forest protection wouldn't have happened otherwise. A naturally speculative effort with so many shades of gray that the Nature Conservancy, for example, can justify an offsetting project on property that they themselves had already preserved. At the core of this triangle, though, and largely the reason it isn't heeded at every turn, is the need for dogged monitoring and accounting. 2 management mechanisms in a field defined by price points and expedience that require time and money and therefore plague offsetting projects well beyond forestry. Theoretically, though, if an offset scheme can verifiably determine a baseline, verifiably account for or assure permanence, verifiably account for or prevent leakage, and verifiably prove additionality, then it might actually work. Under these constraints, well-intentioned actors have aimed to innovate more advanced, more effective systems of carbon offsetting. Perhaps the most promising of these alternatives stems from one surprisingly specific process. This is the Koppal district of India's Karnataka state. Roughly 1.4 million people are spread across its dry, rocky landscape, making a living largely by growing groundnuts and grains. Of this population, 99% rely on traditional cook stoves. More often than not, that means they're using three-stone fires, where a trio of rocks is used to elevate a pot over a fire fueled by wood, coal, dung, or other biomass fuels. The Koppal district is in good company. Globally, 3 billion of us rely on similar traditional stoves for cooking. They can be built and fueled simply by gathering what exists around us, but the advantages pretty much end there. The thermal efficiency of three-stone fires, as in the percent of heat created that actually makes it to the pot, is just 10%. That's colossally low, especially compared to the 75% thermal efficiency of the typical electric stovetop. Therefore, the average household that cooks on a three-stone fire uses between 11 and 26 pounds or 5 and 12 kilograms of wood per day. Burning such a quantity of wood every single day clearly has a sizable environmental impact. In fact, some 25% of global black carbon emissions, a damaging pollutant, stems from this style of cooking. Of course, those using three-stone fires do so out of necessity. They either can't afford or don't have the infrastructure to support gas or electric stoves. But there is an intermediate alternative. It's called the improved cook stove. Essentially, this is a catch-all term to describe biomass-fueled stoves with higher thermal efficiency, often around 20 or 30%. With higher thermal efficiency, the fuel need is lower, and so a household switching from a three-stone fire to an improved cook stove is estimated to eliminate between 1.5 and 4 tons of carbon emissions per year. This is a hefty amount, roughly equivalent to the average annual carbon footprint of a whole person in one of these households, or to flying between New York and Singapore 5 times. So replacing these with these would go a long way to reducing emissions, but the problem is that improved cook stoves are expensive. Their 1,400 rupee cost is equivalent to a week of income for the average Koppal district resident. However, 1,400 rupee is only 18 American dollars, a minuscule amount to pay to offset such an amount of flying, for example. Therefore, cook stove replacement was a prime candidate for financing through carbon credits, a perfect solution where certain individuals value an action above its cost simply for its environmental benefits. On top of that, the math was simpler. The higher the thermal efficiency, the lower the emission should be. Having identified that, NGOs globally started distributing improved cook stoves to households reliant on the three-stone fire, including in the Koppal district, where 43,000 stoves were distributed to 21,500 families in exchange for the organizer selling 43,215 tons of carbon offsets per year for a decade. Now, what takes the system of cook stove replacement carbon offsetting from theoretically good to great is its myriad co-benefits. The advantages stretch beyond just environmental. To start with, gathering those huge quantities of wood to fuel traditional stoves takes time, an average of 18 hours a week in fact. Researchers have found that overwhelmingly, the task of gathering wood for cooking is left to women and girls, and it takes time that would often otherwise be spent on education, for example. Therefore, the use of improved cook stoves, which require an average of only 5 hours of wood gathering per week, could help close the education gender gap observed in many poorer regions. On top of that, cooking is typically completed inside one's house, so the smoke inhaled by users of traditional cook stoves is equivalent to smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Improved cook stoves do not eliminate smoke, but they do lessen it, so their distribution works to eliminate some of the 4.3 million annual premature deaths attributable to household air pollution. Improved cook stove programs can also create local jobs manufacturing and maintaining stoves, they can reduce unsustainable local deforestation, the co-benefits stretch on, and so it's no wonder why, in the face of compounding stories of disastrously ineffective forest protection programs, cook stove replacement was heralded by everyone from the United Nations to Hillary Clinton as the next big innovation in carbon offsetting. The math was simpler, the additionality was indisputable, the co-benefits were myriad, and the costs were low. These programs had the potential to finally offer carbon-conscious companies and consumers a truly verifiable way to actually offset their impact on the world, so long as theory translated into reality. To test their program's effectiveness, researchers put hundreds of households in the Koppal district into a test group. Half were given the improved cook stoves immediately, and half had to wait a year to act as the control group. The researchers then tracked the various households' wood consumption to see how well it lined up with the predicted decline. With stoves increasing from 10 to 30% thermal efficiency, offsets were sold based on a theoretical 67% reduction in wood consumption. What the researchers found was that when actually used on the ground in the Koppal district, the improved cook stove households averaged 7.9 pounds or 3.6 kilograms in daily wood consumption. However, crucially, the control group used 9.3 pounds or 4.2 kilograms. Improved cook stoves only led to a 15% decline in wood consumption, so little that it couldn't even be considered statistically significant by the study. That's to say, according to these results, hundreds of thousands of faulty carbon credits were sold to individuals and companies who believed they were genuinely eliminating carbon from the atmosphere. Individuals who paid a premium over the forest protection alternative to finance the purportedly more effective form of carbon offsetting. What happened on the ground is that individuals' actions didn't conform to the optimistic beliefs of the program's designers. Almost half of the subject households didn't exclusively use the improved cook stoves. They kept using their 3-stone fires simultaneously. This is a phenomenon so common that it has a dedicated term, stove stacking, and a whole subset of research into its causes. Broadly, stove stackers say they do so because it saves time. The more burners, the better. That means the main solution to stove stacking is giving each household more stoves, but less carbon is going to be offset by the third stove as opposed to the first, given less frequent use, so achieving the more verifiable version of a cook stove replacement program comes with additional cost per ton offset. Another core co-benefit of improved cook stoves is that they make cooking easier, but unsurprisingly, making cooking easier often means people cook more. There is almost always suppressed demand among traditional cook stove users, and so this makes accounting for the carbon saved by the switch all the more difficult. Given this difficulty, not all programs confront real-world conditions in their design. United Nations Clean Development Mechanism certified cook stove replacement programs are not required to test the stoves and the extent of their fuel savings in the field. Program designers can base their math off laboratory tests, the tests that led to the failed assumptions of the Copal District program, such as measuring how much wood is necessary with each stove type to boil a given unit of water. Alternate independent certifiers, such as the Gold Standard, require real-world kitchen performance tests, measuring actual wood consumption in the actual project location by actual users over a span of days, but not all experts agree that the more stringent path is the correct one. Water boiling tests are quick, cheap, and easy. Kitchen performance tests are slow, expensive, and complicated. That cost has to be passed on to the ultimate purchaser of carbon credits, and so this opens up a broader, more subjective question. Is it really worth it to increase cost to increase accuracy? Many cook stove replacement programs, including those based on less precise water boiling tests, are genuinely effective, but more of the kitchen performance test-based versions are effective. So, is it worth increasing cost? Is it worth risking fewer carbon credits sold to be more confident that those credits are actually effective? Right now, the market seems to say no. The least accurate type of carbon offsetting programs, forest protection programs, are generally the lowest cost and hold a majority of the carbon offsetting market. Meanwhile, the theoretically most accurate type of carbon offsetting, direct air capture, where complex machinery literally sucks carbon out of the air, is the most expensive and barely exists at commercial scale. Consumers in the carbon market are making their purchasing decisions as they always do. If it costs $10 to offset a ton of carbon through one program and $15 through another, why would they pick the latter? The public overwhelmingly has neither the ability nor the desire to analyze the particulars of individual carbon offsetting programs, so the cheapest option presented to them almost always wins. But that cheapest option is the one with the greatest uncertainty over whether it will actually work. It's the one with the greatest potential for the numbers to be fudged by nefarious players looking to turn a profit. All the stories are about projects where the carbon offset was overstated. None are about carbon offset being understated. If people are given the opportunity to turn a profit by fudging the numbers, people are going to turn a profit by fudging the numbers. Not only is the market enabling this action, it's incentivizing it by funneling the vast majority of money into the cheapest, least verifiable, most exploitable projects. And this isn't one of those situations where perfect is the enemy of good. Carbon offsets are a form of sin tax. Individuals and companies buy them to alleviate the cognitive dissonance that stems from doing something that accelerates climate change. Therefore, if a person decides to take that transatlantic flight because they can negate their emissions concerns simply by checking the offset box at checkout, that offset has to be 100% effective to not do harm. If that offset is just 90% effective, if the offsetting potential is just slightly overstated, if families cook just slightly more than expected due to the convenience of their new and improved cook stoves, the environment is in a worse place than where it started due to carbon offsets. Any behavioral economist would agree that carbon offsetting does lead to at least some individuals or companies emitting more than they would if it wasn't an option, so this scenario is not a fantasy. Therefore, carbon offsetting, a practice presented as an innovative solution to the world's carbon problem, has an extremely high risk of actually raising emissions. Whether it does that is an entirely different, unanswerable question. Given the complexity of just accounting for the carbon offset by an individual program, entering that industry-wide would be entirely impossible. But the potential is there. It's not that every carbon offset program is a scam. There are plenty of extremely well-managed programs run by people genuinely trying to make the world better that have truly verifiable offsetting impact and truly advantageous co-benefits. Carbon can be truly offset, but that's not what the market incentivizes. The market incentivizes the scam. The market incentivizes a race to the bottom. The market incentivizes the scenario where carbon offsetting as a cohesive phenomenon has genuine potential to accelerate our march towards climate catastrophe. If you've made it to the end of this video, you've clearly realized that, believe it or not, talking climate policy can actually be interesting. The world is changing faster than ever, and as catastrophic as that is, it's also fascinating to watch unfold in real time. I've certainly realized that over the years, especially as I produced 2 documentaries about the subject. One profiling the Marshall Islands, the country that's expected to be the first to become uninhabitable due to sea level rise, and another looking at the Colorado River, the primary water source for the American Southwest, which uses more water than the environment provides each year, putting the region on the path towards an imminent water shortage disaster. Each of these projects was produced on location with a rather big budget thanks to the funding provided by Nebula and by extension all the Nebula viewers, so you can watch both of these over there. Of course, Nebula is the streaming site that I and a bunch of other smart creators started to act as the best possible home to the stuff we make. We post our regular videos over there early and ad-free, exclusive videos we call Nebula Plus, and high-budget Nebula Originals. We also release videos from our new channel, Jetlag the Game, an entire week early on Nebula. Most of the channels with the highest audience overlap with Wendover are also on the platform, so chances are you already watch plenty of Nebula creators. But what makes this the best deal in streaming is that you can get 2 streaming sites for less than the price of one. Signing up via curiositystream.com/Wendover bundles the 2 platforms together for just $14.79 a year with the current sale price, and of course that also means you get access to all of CuriosityStream's great library of non-fiction shows and documentaries, like their fantastic show Engineering the Future. Signing up for the best deal in streaming gives you the best possible viewing experience of the creators you already know and love, gets you access to a huge catalog of new content you'll probably love too, and it even helps support this channel, so click the button on screen or head over to curiositystream.com/Wendover to sign up for the bundle deal today.